I was discarded like trash by my own family. I'm not exaggerating. I'm not using a figure of speech. They decided my fate without inviting me into the conversation. They separated my belongings. They talked about my life as if I had already left the room, as if I were no longer a person. I was inside the house when it happened. I heard my name being used as a problem. I heard sentences spoken in low voices, the kind meant to avoid confrontation. I heard decisions being made about where I should stay, what I could keep, what no longer made sense. Each word felt like it was pushing my body a few inches farther out of that place. When I walked into the room, the silence was immediate. Not an awkward silence, a rehearsed one, an organized silence. The kind that comes after an agreement has already been made. I felt the cold floor under my feet, felt my heart beating strangely off rhythm. In that moment, I understood something no one had the courage to say out loud. My presence was a problem, not because I was loud, but because I still existed. They used clean words to justify something dirty. They talked about care, about practicality, about organization. My belongings became stacked boxes. My history became an inventory. A piece of my life was folded in a hurry and shoved into a corner, as if it were in the way of the house's flow. When I tried to speak, I was calmly interrupted. They said I was being sensitive, that I wasn't understanding things correctly, that it would be better to talk later. Later. Always later. That was when something broke inside me. It wasn't my heart. It was the illusion of belonging. I wasn't being forgotten. I was being removed. And the cruelest part wasn't the exclusion. It was realizing that everyone there knew exactly what was happening, except me, the one who should have been at the center of it. If you've ever felt like people were deciding your life without asking you, stay with me. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell me in the comments, when did you realize you had become an inconvenience within your own family? There was a time when that family functioned because I was there, not as an authority, as a presence. I was the quiet axis, the person who woke up before everyone else, who knew where the documents were, who noticed mood shifts before words were spoken. None of that was Zena's strength. It was treated as a natural obligation. I remember mornings in the kitchen, the smell of coffee brewed too early, the table still cold, me organizing the day while everyone else slept. I remember folding clothes that weren't mine, writing down messages, solving small problems before they turned into arguments. I did all of that without ever thinking it would one day be erased. Back then, I believed care created place, that presence built belonging. Today I understand that I didn't become invisible overnight. I was erased gradually. First they stopped asking me. Then they started deciding for me. Finally, they began acting as if it had always been that way. As if my participation had been minimal, as if my memory were failing. When I look back, I see sacrifices no one ever mentions. Hours spent in waiting rooms, difficult conversations I carried alone, decisions postponed because someone needed me. None of that became history. None of it was remembered when they began treating me like a burden. The contrast between who I was and who they later said I was hurt more than any direct insult. Hearing my own life retold by people who only showed up at the end was a quiet shock. Suddenly, I was the fragile one, the confused one, the one who needed to be protected. I felt it in my body, a strange tightness when I entered the room, an exaggerated carefulness in their words, a quick glance exchanged when I spoke too much. Little by little, I understood that my role had changed without anyone ever telling me. I tried to adapt. I spoke less, asked fewer questions, took up less space, thinking maybe there would still be a corner left for me. But abandonment doesn't shrink when you make yourself smaller. It just becomes more organized. I was still the same woman, but to them I had become something else. Something inconvenient, something outdated, something that needed to be dealt with. At that point, I wasn't yet suspicious of documents or hidden decisions, but I felt with painful clarity that something had shifted, not in me, in them. And when a family shifts emotionally, someone is always left behind. In that story, that someone had become me. I just didn't know yet how carefully that change had been planned. The meeting happened without me, not because I wasn't home. I was there, in the next room, just a few feet away. Even so, no one called me. No one thought it was necessary. I found out the worst way possible, by accident. A sentence said too quickly, and we already took care of that. That slipped out without caution. My name came right after, used not as a person, but as an unresolved issue. I felt my stomach drop before I even understood what it was about. I asked. They pretended to be surprised, said I had misunderstood, that it was nothing important. But something had already changed in the air. Conversations stopped when I walked in. Doors started closing more often, not forcefully, intentionally. In the days that followed, I noticed small absences. Folders that had always been in the same place. A missing box, an envelope I was sure I had put away. At first, I thought it was disorganization. Then I realized it wasn't mess. It was selection. I learned through others that important decisions had been made. These weren't assumptions. They were facts. They talked about where I would stay, about what would be best from now on. Everything decided with a strange kind of care that didn't include my voice. The hardest part wasn't learning about the plan. It was realizing it was already in motion. I walked into the bedroom and saw my belongings separated, not thrown out. Separated. Clothes folded without affection. Objects gathered without history. Papers stacked as if they were just paper. I stood there for a few seconds, holding an old folder, feeling the weight of that simple act. My life had been organized without me. That's when I understood everything. They weren't improvising. They had already talked. They had already agreed. They had already decided. I was the last to know, because I was the only one who might disagree. The shock didn't come as a scream. It came as silence. A calculated silence that said everything without explaining anything. I felt my feet cold on the floor, my body stiff, my breath shallow. It wasn't fear. It was the precise awareness of being carefully pushed out, gently enough not to look like cruelty. There was no official announcement, no courage for that. There was discreet execution, as if my exclusion needed to look natural, technical, inevitable. In that moment, something inside me reorganized itself. It wasn't anger, it was attention. A cold, new, uncomfortable attention. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to understand what was happening. I was accepting what had already happened. They had decided my fate, and they had no intention of going back. I didn't yet know how or when, but I knew right then that this wouldn't be the end. It would be the beginning of something they weren't prepared to face. Because decisions made in the dark have a serious problem. When the light comes on, there's no pretending nothing was done. I tried to speak, not to accuse, not to confront, just to exist inside a decision that had clearly already been made without me. I chose simple words, the kind that don't trigger defensiveness. Even so, I couldn't finish my first sentence. I was interrupted gently, a trained kind of gentleness. They said I was nervous, that it wasn't the right moment, that we would talk later, calmly. Later. Always later. A later that exists only to push someone out of the conversation without looking aggressive. I felt my face grow warm, not from anger, but from embarrassment, as if I were asking for something inappropriate. Every attempt I made was treated as exaggeration. A sigh became proof of instability. My silence became agreement. I began to realize that any reaction would be used against me. If I spoke, I confirmed I was emotional. If I stayed quiet, I confirmed that I accepted it. The looks started to weigh on me. They weren't looks of care. They were looks of adjustment, like people checking whether a plan is working. I saw complicity where there had once been routine. I saw urgency where there had once been patience. And something hit me hard. I saw relief. Relief that I finally seemed difficult. Difficult enough to justify everything. That's when I understood. They weren't dealing with me as someone who needed to be heard. They were dealing with me as a problem that needed to be managed. I was no longer part of the family. I was an inconvenient variable. At a certain point, I realized no one was actually listening to what I was saying. They were just waiting for me to finish so they could continue with the script that had already been written. Their silence wasn't empty. It was full of prepared answers. Every pause on my part felt calculated to push me one step further out. My body reacted before my mind did. My hands went cold. My breathing shortened. A strange tightness formed in my chest. It wasn't fear. It was quiet humiliation. The exact sensation of being treated like something defective that needed to be removed before it caused disruption. I tried to explain myself, and that's where I made the mistake they were waiting for. I explained too much. I went back to the past. I talked about intentions. I gave context. I saw the immediate effect. Their faces relaxed, not from understanding, from victory. They exchanged a quick glance. A small glance, almost imperceptible, but far too clear to ignore. A look that said, "See?" That was the moment I understood something fundamental. Their silence carried more weight than any word of mine, because their silence was strategy. Mine wasn't. I left that conversation smaller than I had entered it, not because they yelled at me, but because they placed me in a position where I had to justify my right to exist. I walked slowly back to the bedroom, feeling the floor under my feet, trying to understand when speaking had become a mistake. There, alone, certainty formed without noise. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't miscommunication. This was organized exclusion. That had been a test. And I had just realized I was surrounded. But I realized something else too. Something uncomfortable and powerful. Anyone who needs to silence me to maintain control has already lost part of it. I didn't yet know how to use that information, but I knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. After that conversation, I stopped trying to be understood. Something inside me realized that explanations wouldn't protect me. What I needed now wasn't to convince anyone, it was to understand. I started slowly, without drawing attention, the way I always had when something needed to work. I pulled out old boxes, the ones I myself had organized years earlier. Folders with faded labels, papers I had never questioned because I trusted the people who presented them. In that moment, trust was no longer enough. I sat at the dining table, late afternoon light coming in through the window, and began to read, line by line, no rush, no emotion. It was unsettling to notice how many times I had signed things without truly choosing. Not because anyone forced me, but because everything came wrapped in reassuring phrases. This is just to make things easier. We can adjust it later. You don't need to worry about this now. Now was exactly the time. The dates caught my attention first. Some decisions had been made far too quickly for something so important. Others appeared as consequences of conversations I didn't remember ever having. Nothing screamed fraud. And maybe that was the point. Everything looked just correct enough to avoid immediate suspicion. I began cross-checking information. One document said one thing, another said something similar, but not the same. Small differences, almost invisible to anyone reading in a hurry. But I had spent my life noticing when things didn't quite line up, keeping that family functioning. Now I was using the same skill to protect myself. I noticed technical terms that had never been explained, clauses that required understanding, not just a signature, and little by little it became clear. There had been no real consent. There had been guidance. My body reacted as I read, a tightening in my stomach, a furrowed brow, my breathing growing shallow. It wasn't panic. It was clarity arriving too heavily to ignore. I closed one of the folders and stared at the table for a few seconds, trying to organize not the papers, but the impact of what I was realizing. Nothing there had been done with open aggression, and that made it more cruel. Because decisions like these hide behind care, behind good intentions, behind the idea that someone else knows better than you how to run your own life. By the time I finished, I had no doubts. Something had been done without my full awareness, as that explained their urgency, their control, the excessive care with words, the need to keep me confused. For the first time, I allowed myself a thought I had long avoided. Maybe the problem was never my fragility. Maybe the problem was that I was starting to understand too much. I closed all the folders carefully, like someone ending a chapter. I didn't yet have definitive proof. But I had something just as dangerous to anyone who depends on another person's silence, coherence. And when logic starts to make sense, lies lose ground. I knew I couldn't keep going alone for much longer. This required confirmation. Someone who could look at all of it without history, without affection, without inherited guilt. But before asking for help, I needed to be sure of one thing. I wasn't imagining any of it, and everything inside me said that I wasn't. I didn't ask for help on impulse. I spent a few days trying to organize everything on my own, the way I always had. Reviewing papers, rereading notes, walking through the house in silence. But there came a moment when I understood something simple and hard to accept. If I stayed alone, I would eventually start doubting myself again. And that was exactly what I had been taught to do. That's when I spoke to her. Someone from the outside. No ties to my family. No interest in pleasing me or silencing me. I chose someone who owed me nothing. No affection, no loyalty. Just listening. I spoke sitting at the table, hands resting on my lap, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't tell everything in order. I skipped parts, went back. At times, I felt the urge to apologize for talking too much, an old reflex. But she didn't rush me. She didn't interrupt. She didn't finish my sentences. As I spoke, she simply listened. Sometimes she tilted her head slightly. Other times, she asked short, direct questions, the kind that don't push toward a conclusion but open space. When was this signed? Who was present? Did anyone explain what would change afterward? Those simple questions hit harder than any advice, because no one had ever asked me questions like that before. People had always acted as if someone else had already decided. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel pressured to reach a comforting conclusion. I didn't feel that familiar urgency of, let's just resolve this. She didn't look at me like someone fragile. She looked at me like someone trying to understand something serious. When I finished, I went quiet. I waited for the response I had heard so many times in my life, that I was overreacting, that families are complicated, that I needed to trust more. None of that came. She took a breath, looked back at the papers, and said something simple, almost emotionless. This isn't clear. And when something isn't clear, the person asking questions isn't wrong. That sentence didn't bring immediate relief. It brought ground, a kind of quiet firmness, as if someone had placed a foot in front of a door that had been closing on me for years. She pointed out details I had noticed myself, but always dismissed as me being dramatic. She said decisions like those should be explained with real care, not with soothing phrases. That constant silence isn't a sign of peace. It's a sign of exclusion. My body responded before my thoughts did. My shoulders dropped slightly. My breathing deepened. Not because everything was solved, but because for the first time, I wasn't alone with that perception. She didn't tell me what to do. She didn't suggest confrontation. She didn't encourage conflict. She simply validated something essential. My doubts had a foundation. And that changes everything. Because when doubt stops being guilt, it becomes a tool. I left that conversation different, quieter, more alert, not angry, focused. For the first time, I allowed myself a thought I had always avoided. Maybe I wasn't confused. Maybe someone was trying to keep me that way. That idea didn't come with panic. It came with clarity. Because if I wasn't wrong, then someone had an interest in me continuing to doubt myself. In that moment, I gained something I hadn't had in a long time. A point of support outside my family's silence. It wasn't protection. It was validation. And sometimes, that's all a person needs to stop shrinking. I didn't yet know how far this would go. But I knew that from then on, I wasn't carrying everything alone anymore. And that alone had already shifted the balance of the story. They still believed I was isolated, but I wasn't anymore. And when isolation breaks, control begins to fail. I chose the moment carefully. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed to observe how they would react once the questions stopped being vague. Once I stopped asking permission to understand my own life. It was an ordinary afternoon. Nothing formal, nothing dramatic. The table set as always, chairs in their usual places. The setting was everyday, and that mattered. I didn't want to create an event. I wanted to see what would happen when routine was interrupted by truth. I started with something simple, a document, a date, a specific detail I already knew, but needed to hear from them. I asked calmly, looking them in the eye, without accusation. The answer came too fast and too vague. They said I was mixing things up, that it had already been explained, that I was insisting on something irrelevant. The tone wasn't aggressive, it was defensive, and that caught my attention. People who are secure don't rush their answers. I continued, asked another question, then another. I kept my voice low. I didn't raise my head. I didn't gesture. I simply waited for answers that never came fully formed. That's when the atmosphere shifted. Chairs adjusted, bodies leaned forward. The conversation stopped being casual and became territory. The familiar phrases arrived, spoken with false concern. You're creating confusion. This is getting exhausting. Why don't you trust us? Trust. Always that word. Used not as a bridge, but as a barrier. I realized they didn't want to clarify anything. They wanted me to stop. And when that didn't work, the inversion came. The problem was no longer the document. It was me, my tone, my insistence, my memory, my age, even without being said directly. I was treated as emotionally unstable for wanting to understand decisions that directly affected my life. I observed every pause that lasted too long, every answer that didn't connect to the one before, every attempt to push me back into the role of someone who gets in the way. My body was alert, hands resting on the table, feet planted firmly on the floor. I breathed slowly, feeling the weight of the scene. It wasn't anger, it was awareness. They weren't prepared for someone who didn't back down. They weren't used to my focused attention. At one point, I felt the accusation in the air before it was even spoken. And when it came, it was veiled, but clear. I was putting everything at risk, creating unnecessary tension, as if truth were an inconvenience. What was most revealing was that no one truly tried to explain anything. There was no effort to reassure me with facts, only attempts to silence me with emotion, guilt, fatigue, urgency. That's when something became physically clear to me. If I were wrong, they would have arguments. If I were confused, they would have patience. But what I saw was something else. I saw fear, a discreet fear hidden behind improvised authority. They didn't want to resolve the conversation. They wanted to end it. When I stopped talking, it wasn't because they convinced me. It was because I had already seen enough. That confrontation wasn't meant to clarify anything. It was meant to measure strength. And I had just realized that by asking questions, I had crossed an invisible line. They understood that I was no longer passive. And I understood that from that point on, every step I took would be watched. I left that table with a tired body, but an oddly clear mind. The game had changed. They still felt in control, but something essential had slipped through their fingers. The certainty that I would keep accepting ready-made versions. And when that certainty breaks, nothing stays stable for very long. The detail was far too small to justify the weight I felt when I found it. A line out of place. A word repeated where it shouldn't have been. If I was still trying to keep the peace, I would have ignored it. If I were tired, I would have closed the folder. But I was no longer willing to pretend things were normal. I went back to the documents with a different kind of attention. Not the attention of someone looking for mistakes, the attention of someone looking for coherence. I compared older versions with more recent copies. I reviewed dates carefully, resting the paper on the table, running my finger along the lines as if I needed to feel the path. That's when I noticed something unsettling. A major decision appeared recorded, as if it had been made in my name before I had ever been informed. It wasn't an obvious forgery. It was something more sophisticated, a shift. Time rearranged to look legitimate, as if the story had been edited after it was lived. That line led to another, then another. And without realizing it, I was reconstructing an entire sequence of events that had never been fully explained to me. Everything done with technical care. Neutral language, words that don't raise suspicion when read in isolation. But together, they told a story too clear to be coincidence. My body reacted slowly. First, a tightening in my stomach, then tension at the base of my neck. I adjusted myself in the chair, planted my feet on the floor, took a deep breath. I needed clarity, not panic, because what was emerging was bigger than a misunderstanding. I realized, with painful clarity, that someone had benefited from my silence, not just financially. They benefited in control, in autonomy over decisions that should never have been made without me. I had been placed in the position of someone who had agreed, when in reality, I had simply never been given full access to the information. That's when the exclusion began to make sense. It hadn't been personal at first. It had been practical. My presence got in the way because I could ask questions, because I remembered details, because I connected things they preferred to keep separate. The problem wasn't emotional. It was strategic. I started revisiting past situations under this new light. Conversations abruptly cut short. Topics changed too quickly. Explanations too rushed for decisions that were far too big. There had always been a sense of urgency that I mistook for efficiency. Now I saw it for what it was. Guidance. A constant, almost gentle push away from the center of decisions. There was also a pattern that became impossible to ignore. Everything that distanced me came wrapped in the language of protection. So you don't worry. So you don't get overwhelmed. To make your life easier. Care was always the final argument, and for a long time, I accepted it, because trusting felt safer than confronting. The deepest pain wasn't realizing something had been done behind my back. It was realizing how long it had been happening. This wasn't a single act. It was a process. Small, continuous, almost elegant. A gradual removal designed so that I would eventually start doubting my own need to be present. I felt shame, not for being deceived, but for being trained not to question. for believing my role was to soften conflicts, not demand clarity, to make other people's lives easier, even if it cost me my own autonomy. I closed the documents and stayed seated for a few minutes, staring at the table, unable to stand up. The afternoon light had shifted. The silence in the house felt heavier. There was no more room for naivety, but there was also no room for explosion. What this required was a different posture, colder, more attentive. I knew I couldn't confront anyone yet. If I did that without something solid, I would only reinforce the narrative they had already built about me. I needed to understand exactly who had benefited, how, and since when. That's when I understood something essential. The exclusion hadn't been the beginning. It had been the consequence. They moved me away because I was too close to the truth. And now that I had seen this detail, there was no way to pretend I couldn't see the rest. Something serious had been done behind my back, and it wasn't going to stay buried. But to move forward safely, I needed more than intuition. I needed someone who could look at this without emotion, without ties, without fear. Someone who understood the real weight of that kind of detail. And as I put the papers back into the folder, I already knew exactly what the next step would be. Because from that point on, this was no longer just a family wound. It was a real problem. And problems like that aren't solved with kitchen table conversations. They're solved with organized truth. After that discovery, the past began to reorganize itself inside me. Not as scattered memories, but as sequence. Old situations I had always treated as isolated discomforts started fitting together with unsettling precision. Nothing felt random anymore. I remembered conversations cut off halfway through, decisions that were already settled before I even knew they existed. Moments when my opinion was heard patiently but never actually considered. At the time, I called that harmony. Now I saw it as quiet control. There were people I was gradually pushed away from, small comments framed as concern. She doesn't help. She confuses you. It's better to avoid her. Nothing direct, nothing aggressive. But over time, I found myself alone, without knowing exactly when the isolation had begun. I thought it was coincidence. It wasn't. I revisited public moments where I had been gently discredited, always with a smile, always in a light tone. She's been forgetful. She gets tired easily. Let's spare her. Phrases that sounded like protection but worked as warnings to others. Don't fully trust her. The impact of that realization didn't come in waves. It came as constant weight, a kind of pain that doesn't scream but presses against your chest from the inside. Because this wasn't just about being deceived. It was about having been trained over years to doubt my own perception. My body reacted as I remembered. Tense shoulders, a locked jaw, short breath. I sat on the couch and stayed there for a few minutes, staring at the wall, feeling the silence of the house. It wasn't pure sadness, it was recognition. Age hadn't created that situation. It had only made it convenient. The ground had already been prepared. The exclusion just needed a final push. That was hard to accept, but also freeing, because it took away the guilt I had carried for so long. I understood then that my fragility had never been real. It had been constructed, reinforced every time I questioned something, every time I tried to take up space, every time my clarity threatened someone else's comfort. That understanding brought something unexpected, calm, a firm, almost cold calm. When you understand the mechanism, it loses strength. Fear decreases, guilt shifts, pain becomes information. I stopped asking why they were doing this to me. I started asking since when, and that shift changed everything. I began writing things down, not to torment myself, but to organize dates, situations, who was present, what was said, what was implied. Everything that once felt vague now started taking shape. It wasn't proof yet. It was a map. Clarity began to replace pain. It didn't erase the suffering, but it gave it meaning. I wasn't being pushed aside because I was insufficient. I was being pushed aside because at some point, I became a risk. And that realization completely changed how I saw myself. I wasn't weak. I was inconvenient to people who needed silence. That was an internal turning point. It was no longer just about understanding what had been done to me. It was about recognizing who I needed to become from then on. More attentive, more grounded, less willing to soften what needed to be seen. But to move forward safely, I knew I had to go beyond emotional interpretation. This was no longer just a family conflict. It was too serious to be handled only with memory and intuition. I needed someone who could analyze all of this without affection, without shared history, without fear of upsetting anyone. Someone trained to see exactly what I was beginning to see. And at that point, I knew there was no way to keep pretending things were normal. What I had in my hands wasn't just accumulated discomfort. It was a real problem. And problems like that, when ignored, only grow. When faced, they change everything. I brought everything to him without dramatizing it. I didn't speak as a vent. I spoke as someone who needed to understand facts. I laid the documents out on the table, one by one, carefully, as if each page carried its own weight. I explained the context without rushing, skipped emotions, stayed with events. Then I went quiet. He didn't look surprised, and that affected me more than any exaggerated reaction would have. He read everything in silence, a focused, professional silence. He turned the pages slowly, adjusted his glasses, went back a few paragraphs. At one point, he rested his finger on a specific line and stayed there for a few seconds. He didn't comment. He just noted it. That pause said more than many words. The questions came afterward, short, precise. When was this presented to you? Did anyone explain the consequences? Did you have a real option to refuse? They weren't emotional questions. They were structural. And with each answer I gave, I felt something strange in my body. Not fear, but confirmation, as if everything was finally being placed where it belonged. He explained carefully that there were clear inconsistencies, that certain decisions require full information, not just a signature. That consent is not the absence of resistance. It's real understanding. He said this without indignation, without drama, like someone describing something he had seen before. Then came the moment that changed the weight of that conversation. He closed the folder, leaned back in his chair, and stayed silent for a few seconds. He looked at me firmly, without pity, without urgency, and said, "This doesn't look like a mistake. It looks like an arrangement that grew too large to sustain." I felt a chill move up my spine. Not panic, seriousness. When someone trained to avoid strong conclusions chooses words like that, it's because real consequences are being measured. He was clear. Any emotional confrontation at that point would only reinforce the narrative against me. He said people who build this kind of structure depend on two things: silence and discredit. And when one of those foundations begins to crack, they move quickly to protect what they've created. He talked about patience, about documentation, about observing more than reacting. He explained that often the fatal error isn't the initial act, but the excessive confidence of those who believe they'll never be questioned. The word silence came back, but now with a different meaning. Not imposed silence, chosen silence. I left that meeting changed, not relieved, not vengeful, prepared. For the first time, I felt that someone was looking at the situation without emotional ties, without inherited guilt, without fear of displeasing anyone. Someone who saw what I saw, and farther. He didn't promise victory. He promised clarity. And clarity at that moment was worth more than any promise of quick justice. Because it meant that if something serious was hidden there, it would no longer depend on my emotional strength to surface. When I stepped outside, I paused for a few seconds, took a deep breath, and felt the cold air on my face. For the first time since all of this began, I was certain that the story had crossed the line of the personal. This was no longer just about family. It was about truth. And truths like that don't like to stay hidden, especially when someone finally knows exactly where to look. I went back home, determined not to confront in order to win, but to observe. I brought only part of what I knew, enough to provoke a reaction. I didn't mention documents. I didn't talk about lawyers. I didn't present evidence. I asked simple, almost naive questions, like someone still trying to understand. That's when everything changed. Their tone became more careful than ever, excessively careful, almost rigid. The answers came too quickly, as if they had been rehearsed. Before, they tried to calm me down. Now they were trying to contain me. I felt it in my body. Tense shoulders, clenched jaws, eyes that avoided mine. When I mentioned the possibility of revisiting some decisions, the justifications came in sequence. They talked about exhaustion, about stress, about how all of this wasn't good for me. They used my age without saying the word age. They used my health without mentioning doctors. Everything was suggestion. Nothing was direct. But there was something new there. There was fear, not obvious fear, contained fear. The kind that shows up in the rush to end a conversation, in the need to reassert authority, in the excessive effort to appear in control. They began contradicting themselves. Dates shifted. Explanations stopped holding together. The more they tried to organize the narrative, the more it unraveled. I stayed calm, not out of bravery, out of guidance. I kept my hands on the table, my feet firmly on the floor. I watched them defend themselves before being accused. I watched them dodge every question that required real clarity. I watched them try, once again, to push me into the role of the one who gets in the way. That's when I noticed their mistake. They believed I still needed to be convinced. They didn't realize I was only documenting now. The atmosphere grew heavy. Before, it had been indifference. Now, it was tension. They knew something had changed in me, but they didn't know exactly what. And that uncertainty bothered them more than any direct accusation. At a certain point, I felt the threat in the air before it was spoken. It didn't come as a shout. It came as a disguised warning. This could have consequences. You're going too far. Always framed as advice, never as a threat. When the conversation ended, there was no agreement, no clarification. There was urgency. Late phone calls began. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. Doors closed too quickly. I could see the accelerated movement of people trying to protect something unstable. That night I lay in bed unable to sleep. Not because I feared what they might do to me, but because I understood the scale of what was at stake. I had touched a structure, and structures react when they're threatened. But I was no longer alone. And more importantly, I was no longer uninformed. They believed my silence was retreat, that my calm was surrender. They had no idea that while they were trying to protect themselves, something was being prepared with precision. Something that no longer depended on my voice at the family table, but on organized facts, confronted versions, and time, which had begun to work in my favor. The next step wouldn't be emotional, it would be technical. And when that step was taken, there would be no room for performative care or softened versions. Only for the one thing they had always tried to avoid, the full truth. The plan didn't come from revenge. It came from containment. The guidance was clear from the beginning. Observe, document, don't react. Any emotional outburst now would be used against me. Any direct confrontation would reinforce the image they were already trying to build. So I did something that had always been difficult for me. I stopped acting. I began measuring every word, not to please anyone, but to give nothing away. Short answers, neutral sentences, no long explanations. No attempts to convince. They noticed. They were used to my need to understand, to my effort to keep everything running. This new silence didn't look like fragility. It looked like absence. And absence deeply unsettles those who need to control the narrative. Meanwhile, I observed, with cold attention. I noted times, shifts in behavior, conversations that stopped when I entered a room, phone calls that ended too quickly, and exaggerated care with documents that had once been left lying around. All of it spoke louder than any forced confession. I let them believe they had won. That exhaustion had silenced me, that I had accepted the ready-made versions. This was the hardest part, pretending normalcy while everything inside me was on alert. But it was necessary, because people who feel safe make mistakes. I returned to behaving exactly as they expected of me. Discreet, predictable, quiet. Not because it was true, but because that image gave me access. They relaxed. They spoke more freely around me. They underestimated me again. And underestimation is a serious error when someone knows how to wait. Outside that environment, everything was organized methodically. Documents reviewed carefully. Records sorted by date. Notes kept objective, without emotion. Every inconsistency found its place. Every contradiction, its context. There was no rush. There was strategy. I also began observing how each person reacted when they believed they were in control. Who became agitated, who tried to soften things, who hid behind generic phrases. That helped me understand not only what had been done, but who sustained what, who led, who merely agreed. At no point did I think about exposing everything at once. I had learned that truths thrown out without structure can be discredited. They needed to be presented at the right time, by the right person, in the right way. Not as event, as fact. There were difficult nights, moments when anxiety nearly won. When I wanted to scream, demand, confront. But I remembered what was at stake. This wasn't just wounded pride. It was my autonomy, my history, my right not to be erased politely. Strategic silence began to produce effects. They started moving more, protecting more, speaking more than they should. Small rushes, small excesses, small slips. Each one registered mentally with the calm of someone assembling a puzzle while knowing the final image exists. I didn't need them to confess. I just needed them to keep being exactly who they had always been when they thought no one was watching. While they tried to maintain control, something was consolidating outside that space. Something that no longer depended on my presence at the family table. Something that couldn't be silenced with gentle phrases or performative care. The plan wasn't to attack. It was to expose. And exposures like that don't happen in the heat of emotion. They happen when every exit is already closed. They still believed they were in charge, but by that point, control had already shifted. I just hadn't turned on the light yet. And when it did turn on, there would be no room for alternate versions, only for what they had always tried to avoid facing, the complete truth. The lawyer didn't raise his voice. He didn't give a speech. He didn't try to convince anyone. He simply opened the folder. The sound of the clasp echoed louder than any word in that room. I felt my body tense, not with fear, but with focus. Everyone there understood, in that exact moment, that this was no longer a family conversation. It was something else. He began by saying there was something that needed to be clarified, something that had never been said out loud. something that, for a long time, had been kept quiet because it felt more comfortable that way. The word silence landed heavily in the room, not as an accusation, as a fact. He explained with precise calm that certain documents had been structured in a way that created the appearance of consent that had never fully existed. He didn't say anyone had lied. He said essential information had not been presented, that relevant decisions had been made before I had any real conditions to understand what was being decided. As he spoke, I watched faces. I wasn't looking for guilt. I was looking for reaction. I saw eyes avoid contact, bodies shifting in their chairs, that mute tension that appears when someone realizes they've lost control of the narrative. The lawyer placed 2 documents side by side, pointed to dates, showed differences too small to be explained as mistakes. He explained how that created a clear imbalance, benefiting some while progressively removing me from decisions about my own life. No one interrupted him. For the first time, no one interrupted me either. He didn't use harsh language. He didn't say betrayal. He didn't say abuse. He didn't need to. What he described was too simple to deny. He explained that structures like this only survive while the affected person remains discredited, confused, isolated, and that once the facts are organized, the structure becomes indefensible. There was a long silence, a different kind of silence. This wasn't the strategic silence that used to shut me down. This was collapse. The repeated versions began to clash. One corrected the other. One spoke too much. Another fell silent too quickly. Every word spoken made things worse. When they asked if I wanted to say something, I didn't recount my pain. I didn't list sacrifices. I didn't ask for recognition. I simply said, in a low, steady voice, that I had never been informed the way they claimed, that I had never had a real choice, that trust is not the same as consent, nothing more. The lawyer concluded by saying that what was at stake wasn't an emotional conflict, but the validity of decisions built on omission. And omission, when proven, doesn't hold, no matter who committed it. That's when control changed hands, not with shouting, not with humiliation, with exposure. The silence that followed was no longer comfortable for anyone. They couldn't call me confused. They couldn't treat me as overly sensitive. They couldn't gently push me aside anymore. All of that depended on the very silence that had just been broken. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Wholeness, not exaggerated joy, not euphoria, dignity. I didn't win because someone defended me. I won because the truth, finally organized, could no longer be folded to fit anyone's comfort. In that moment, I knew nothing would ever go back to the way it was. And for the first time, that didn't scare me. What fell there wasn't the family. It was the lie that had kept me small inside it. I didn't walk away victorious in the conventional sense. I walked away free. Free from needing to prove my sanity. Free from guilt that was never mine. Free from the obligation to be convenient in order to belong. While everyone else was still trying to process what had happened, I understood something simple and final. This story didn't end with external justice. It began with internal repositioning, and that was something no one could ever take from me. The truth had been spoken, recorded, validated. And once that happens, there is no returning to the place they tried to push me out of in silence. After everything came out, there was no celebration, no hugs, no sincere apologies, no immediate attempt at reconciliation. What followed was silence, a different kind of silence from the one that had crushed me for years. This one didn't make me smaller. It simply existed, like empty space after something collapses. The days that followed felt strange. The house seemed larger, not because someone had left, but because the tension was gone. No one lowered their voice when I entered a room. No one made decisions for me under the guise of care. There were no forced attempts at closeness either. It was as if everyone was relearning how to position themselves, unsure of where I fit now. I watched it all calmly. I didn't feel the urge to demand remorse. What I needed had already happened. The truth had been spoken out loud, recorded, validated. That alone shifts the axis of any relationship. After that, apologies become secondary. Some people avoided me. Others acted as if nothing had happened. A few seemed uncomfortable, as though the exposure had been excessive. I listened, but I didn't absorb it. For the first time, I wasn't carrying emotional responsibility for other people's discomfort. That role was no longer mine. I began reorganizing my routine through small, steady gestures, choosing my own schedule, deciding on my own, saying no without over-explaining. I noticed, with quiet surprise, that the world didn't fall apart when I put myself first. On the contrary, it became simpler. My body responded too. I slept better. I woke up without that constant weight in my chest. I stopped replaying conversations in my head before falling asleep. The state of alert softened. Not because everything was perfect, but because I no longer felt threatened inside my own life. There was sadness, yes. Not for the loss of something that had never been fair, but for the late recognition of how long I had lived trying to fit. That sadness came gently, without despair. It came with understanding, and it passed. Because now it had a name and a boundary. I understood something important. Justice doesn't erase the past, but it repositions the present, and that is enough. I didn't need to rebuild bonds that only existed at the cost of my silence. I needed to rebuild myself with more respect for what I feel and what I know. I began occupying space differently, without announcements, without speeches, simply by being whole. That caused more impact than any confrontation. People who are used to seeing you small are unsettled when you move naturally. Conversations became more objective, less emotion, more boundaries, less expectation, more clarity. There was no dramatic rupture. There was adjustment. An adjustment that removed me from the position of target and placed me in the position of a person. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was the end of a cycle, the cycle where I had to prove I was capable of deciding my own life. Now that was a given, and everything that came next could be built calmly, without rush, without fear. I hadn't only reclaimed control over decisions. I had reclaimed something even more valuable, the right to exist without apologizing for taking up space. Reorganizing my life didn't happen all at once. It was quiet. It was internal. It started the day I stopped asking permission to exist. I stopped giving advance notice. I stopped justifying simple choices. I stopped over-explaining what I felt. I didn't announce changes. I simply began living differently. And that alone said everything. Being discarded didn't destroy me. It woke me up. For a long time, I thought belonging meant enduring, swallowing discomfort, adapting until I disappeared. Today, I understand that some bonds only survive as long as you agree to stay smaller. When you stand whole, those bonds reveal how fragile they really are. And that isn't failure. It's revelation. Not every connection deserves continuity. Not every family knows how to love without controlling. And staying where you're merely tolerated costs far too much. I paid that price for years. I don't anymore. The truth arrived late, yes, but it arrived whole. And when it came, it didn't bring empty revenge or anyone else's humiliation. It brought something far rarer: freedom without guilt. I didn't need to destroy anyone to rebuild myself. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I only needed to stop accepting versions of myself that never fit. Today, when I look back, I don't feel constant anger. I feel clarity. I see who I was. I see where I lost myself trying to keep everything running alone. And most of all, I see who I became when I stopped carrying responsibilities that were never mine. There are ordinary days now, calm days. And that is a huge victory for someone who lived in emotional alert for so long. My body rests. My mind quiets at night. My silence is no longer imposed, it's chosen. If there's one thing this story taught me, it's that it's never too late to place yourself back at the center of your own life, even when others try to convince you otherwise. Even when care is used as control, even when they make you believe you're the problem. You're not. You never were. If this story touched something you've lived, I invite you not to go through it alone. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to remember their own dignity. And tell me in the comments, when did you decide to stop making yourself smaller just to fit into other people's lives? Sometimes, everything begins right there. On the day you choose not to disappear anymore to keep the peace. And from that day on, even if nothing around you changes immediately, something inside you changes forever. And that's something no one can ever take away.